welcome to Arts Express. This is Prairie Miller, and on the show, some people say they watched the debate. I think I watched a medical emergency. Pacifica host Garland Nixon on dissecting the disaster.
Good evening. My name's Garland Nixon. You know, I guess some people say they watched the debate. I think I watched a medical emergency. I was waiting for somebody to come in and do something because that situation was really out of hand. Yikes. Well, here's what we're going to do. My favorite Muslim brother, Shahid Bolson. Let's hear what he has to say.
Well, the debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump should give great relief and reassurance to any of America's global victims who might have been worried that that country could potentially reverse its dramatic decline on the world stage that we've seen over the last few years. Because if nothing else was made clear from that debate, one thing is certain: the empire will not recover. You know, a few people did ask me to do an analysis of the debate. I did watch it. But frankly, I don't see any value in doing a point-by-point breakdown. Let's just take it as a total. Take it in total as a spectacle of American rot that has reached devastating proportions. The only thing holding that house up at this point is the termites. You know, on the issue of Gaza, which was almost completely passed over, both Trump and Biden said things in the debate that would make them eligible for prosecution for war crimes, or which would make Trump eligible if he was elected and if his policy towards Israel aligns with his statements. And Biden, of course, is already eligible for prosecution anyway and should be prosecuted as a conspirator to genocide. But again, the most horrific and most criminal situation in the world today, the issue which will absolutely be uppermost in the minds of millions of voters, was barely addressed in the debate. They barely talked about it. They just sort of passed over it. If you'd gotten distracted for a moment, you would have missed it. And yet, in even that very brief moment, when they did mention the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, both candidates expressed views that in and of themselves are reason for the U.S. to be expelled from the United Nations. Biden, obviously, for sending munitions to a country that is committing genocide and has been blacklisted by the United Nations for murdering children, and Trump for saying that Israel should finish the job. That's what he said, finish the job. And he acted as if the establishment of a Palestinian state is somehow debatable and subject to his approval, when it is, in fact, mandated by international law. But they treat international law as optional. You know, Biden said explicitly that their funding for the Ukraine war is in fact funding for American arms manufacturers, essentially admitting that the war in Ukraine is nothing but a money laundering operation to funnel U.S. tax dollars into the private sector, which, if America was a country of ethics and morals, would be scandalous to say out loud. I mean, again, if you go point by point in that debate, it would be like watching someone vomit and then trying to identify the food that they ate with each stream of nausea. I mean, what should be very, very clear from that debate, and from just the fact that these candidates are running, is that the power structure holds the population in utter contempt. So much contempt, in fact, that they want you to know it. They want you to know how much they hold you in contempt. Both Biden and Trump are nothing but mascots of different power factions among the OCGFC, nothing more. For Biden, you know, he's like a mascot for the neocons. The neocons, you know, the sort of hangers-on of the traditional military-industrial complex, which should show you just how decrepit that faction is. They live in a state of willful nostalgia for the days when American hubris and American arrogance could be backed up, and no one could successfully or feasibly confront them or challenge them. And they're disintegrating as visibly as Biden himself is disintegrating. I mean, we watched whole clumps of Joe Biden's brain just melt over the course of 90 minutes on live television. Trump is a mascot for the newer, globalized faction of the private sector elite, who want America withdrawn from the world, isolated from the world, retracting from the international stage so that they can pursue their a-national interests in the global south. This is the most powerful faction, in my opinion. The interests of these two distinct factions explains any and all differences between Donald Trump's policies and Joe Biden's policies, whatever differences there are. And in either case, as I said, the population has nothing to do with it. The American people have been successfully neutralized, and everyone knows it. Everyone in power knows it. And it is the tragic reality for Americans that the way their country has behaved for as long as anyone can remember means that the undeniably bad news for the U.S., the news that there is only decline and deterioration in their future, is welcomed as blessed, wonderful news to the rest of the planet. People all around the world watch that debate with joy for the exquisite demonstration of America's degradation. And that isn't because the rest of the world is without sympathy for the average American. No. It's a universal truism in the global South and in the Muslim world. Everyone strictly differentiates between the American people and those in power. You can be certain that the 40,000 Gazans that you killed died while believing that your people are good people. And they died hoping that your good people would finally do something through that great democratic system of yours, that great democratic system that you can't stop talking about. They were hoping that your good people would finally do something to make your government stop killing them. So yes, everyone sympathizes with your people, but they don't sympathize with your people more than they sympathize with their own people, with their own families, with their own communities and their own countries, all of which have been victimized by the United States and will be granted some level of relief by the decline of the United States. I mean, Joe Biden, talking about we have to take care of our elderly. I mean, he may as well have been talking about child care. When he talks about elderly care, he's already several years older than the average senior citizen in America. The two of them arguing about golf. You know, who golfs better? Which is not only completely unrelatable to most Americans, but is absolutely ridiculous as proof of fitness, and even more absurd as some sort of a qualification for the presidency. These are two men living in a bubble. You know, each of them is living in a bubble, representing a country that exists in a bubble. Look at how they're deriding you. Look at how they're mocking you to your faces with these candidates that you're expected to believe will actually wield some sort of independent power. It's a joke. They're making a joke on you, which just shows you how delusional they've always been. I mean, I wish I knew whatever gave you confidence in him in the first place, that you could then lose confidence in him. But of course, they don't mean confidence in his competency, because that's irrelevant, and that's never really been something anyone thought he had. What they mean is confidence in whether or not anyone is going to be willing to vote for a carcass on strings. But that's what I mean. They're rubbing your face in how out of touch with reality these so-called leaders are, how cartoonish they are, because they don't even respect your disgust enough to fear you. They'll show you outright that your so-called leaders are pranks, that the real power structure is playing on you because they know you won't do anything about it. They have complete confidence in the fact that they have neutralized you, infantilized your intellect, blurred your cognition, and kept you distracted and diverted and demoralized to the point of societal coma. Now you know what it feels like to be subjugated, to have shells of men installed over you as rulers. Oh yes, the Muslim world and the global South do sympathize with you, because what you did to us, we wouldn't actually wish on our worst enemies, but now it is happening to you. Either way, be it Biden or be it Trump, American isolation will happen. Withdrawal from the world will happen. And there's going to be the same pattern in the United States that the United States instigated all over the world. Division, ethnic and religious tensions, civil strife, poverty, violence, tyranny, severe authoritarian security measures, on and on. All inflicted on you by the empire of the OCGFC, the patricidal private sector elites that you yourselves gave birth to.
All right. That's my man, Shahid Bolson. A lot of the things he said is, this is how I feel. I mean, you know how I feel about the U.S. foreign policy. They go around the world and they steal stuff and they overthrow governments, particularly in Africa and Latin America, in the Muslim regions of the world. They steal their oil. They steal their resources. They take their goods. They subjugate their people. They overthrow their leaders. And then they come back in the United States of America. They fight over getting their fair share. And people call themselves here in America. They say, I'm a progressive. I'm a lefty. Really? Why? Because I'm going to make sure that the people here get their fair share, right? Their fair share of what? You don't want to ask what it's their fair share of. If I go murder a little old woman and take her money and come to you, what are you going to say? Can I have half? Are you going to ignore the fact that it came from an old woman that I murdered? That's what they do here in the United States. They're fighting over their fair share of the pie. The pie is as a result of theft. It's as a result of murder. It's a result of overthrowing governments, assassinating leaders all over Africa, Latin America, the Muslim world. And then they come home and have the unmitigated gall to say to America, we're standing up for democracy in this country. Really?
And now on Arts Express, from Colonialism to Cannes, Guy Pearce on erasing history in his latest film, the Lee Tamahori directed The Convert, a look back dramatically on the historical uprising in his native Aborigine Maori, New Zealand in the 1830s against the British invaders, and Pearce's PTSD British soldier turned preacher who switches sides and joins them in their struggle, and erasing uprising as well in the present time, when Vanity Fair removed in their doctored photo of Pearce at the recent Cannes Film Festival the pin he wore on his jacket in solidarity with Palestine, returning the original photo online only after the embarrassed magazine was outed when their censorship went viral. Guy Pearce will talk about this and more, including previous portrayals he considers political figures, as well as playing Andy Warhol in Factory Girl. First, some scenes from The Convert, then Guy Pearce.
Only those who have been at sea truly grasp the enormity of this world. It is a frightening thing, knowing one day a great price may be demanded of us.
Mr. Monroe, welcome to Epworth.
Thank you.
Not exactly St. Paul's, but you'll make something of it.
I shall do my best.
We're thousands of miles from civilization, surrounded by savages of the most barbaric kind.
There are reports of a warlord out there.
Would that be Akatara?
You know?
I have encountered him personally.
What do you want?
I ask that you spare the lives of these people.
Choose.
I cannot make that choice.
Very well.
It's her father.
This is the path to destruction. Peace cannot be achieved through violence.
Ko te toto wanake, ka utu I te toto. This is a violent land, steeped in blood.
Revenge, death. Go hand in hand.
You fight or you die.
We die as warriors.
Hi.
Hi, hello, and welcome to our show.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Okay, what are your thoughts about the quite ironic film title, The Convert? When you as a white preacher turning up to promote Christianity, potentially wiping out their cultural heritage, and then you yourself end up converted politically to their side, especially with the current rise in rebellious, independent impulses across the global South today?
Well, I think initially when we find my character at the beginning of the film, he is someone who is essentially lost, and in the middle of the story, he gets to kind of express a trauma that he's gone through, and we hopefully get a sense of why he is the way he is at the beginning of the story, and that he's really searching for something and has, taken this opportunity to be he's been offered, being a lay preacher. And so I don't necessarily see him as a man of God. I see him as being given a sort of second chance at life. I think he was probably quite suicidal prior to our story beginning, and really felt that God spoke to him, and essentially he sort of found a calling, I guess, and didn't really. The way we looked at it was that he didn't really know what he was doing. He just, in the world that he'd been in the military and in that part of the UK, and having the experience that he had, he felt stripped bare and had no reason to live anymore. And so this opportunity came, and he took it as a bit of a lifeline. But I don't think that he necessarily knew where he was going, what he was going to be in for, any more than he was sort of blinded by his emotional state at the point that we find him at the beginning of the film. So it's a journey of discovery for him. He certainly wasn't intending to go out and convert the locals. He was offered a job to be the minister of a small settlement town, and I think straight away kind of probably felt a little out of his depth, but instantly felt a sense of compassion for this young girl. And he'd witnessed a battle take place, and that she was extremely vulnerable, and he couldn't do anything other than try to help her. And from there, our story begins.
And speaking of wiping out one's identity in the present, what can you say about Vanity Fair erasing you from their Cannes Festival photo, the pin you're wearing defending Palestinians, and then the magazine only apologizing and returning the original photo of you after being outed online?
Yes, I thought it was. I mean, I put out a little statement saying I thought it was disgraceful, and I've laughed with friends of mine at what the apology was, which was, we didn't mean to use that photo, we meant to use another one, but ultimately someone chose to Photoshop out that pin that I was wearing. So, clearly somebody in the magazine didn't want to see it. So, I mean, yeah, I was disappointed, but I was also, in a way, thankfully, some social media, people who had been online saw that had happened and pointed it out. So in a way, I didn't have to do anything, and it caused a bit of a ruckus. So I thought, well, in a way, more attention was drawn to, my support, I suppose, of Palestine. And the people of Palestine. So in a way, it backfired, I guess. I don't know what Vanity Fair's intention was, to be honest. But whatever it was, it backfired, I think.
Now, what was it about the convert creatively and historically that led you to be passionate about being part of this production?
Well, there were a number of things. First and foremost was Lee Tomahori. Because Lee and I had met 20 years prior and had talked about working together on a number of projects over the years that never managed to come to fruition for either he or I, for various reasons, just being basically unavailable because I was doing other things. And finally, this was an opportunity where we were both able to work together at the same time. So that, and I was always excited about working with Lee because I just loved him as a person. I think he's so bright and inspiring, and he's funny and cheeky. He's got a great sort of outlook, and I just love being around him. And so when he made contact, of course, I was very interested in what this was. And then I found as I was reading it, it was a real page turner, and I didn't know a great deal about this history, but I have a bit of an interest in New Zealand. My father was from New Zealand, not at all Maori, of course, not Indigenous, but I feel I have a connection to New Zealand, and there was just something about this story that really struck me, and it just the vulnerability and the kind of two worlds coming together and trying to understand each other, I found really moving. And I think also, primarily the character that I was offered just felt like something and someone that I could sort of see and picture straight away. So, all of those sort of instant elements were I found exciting and just made me want to make this work. And I in talking to Lee, he's a great historian, so I certainly can't recall all the information that he imparted onto me, but it was amazing listening to him talk about the various sort of moments through history of white settlement and where characters like mine sort of found themselves in the scheme of things, back in that sort of mid-1800s period. So look, the whole thing was really thrilling and yeah, great, just a great opportunity and really lovely, particularly to work with Lee.
And as an Australian, what are your thoughts about history playing out dramatically in the present time with the release of Julian Assange from prison and his return to Australia?
Well, I certainly think he's served his time. I mean, as we know, he's been, in exile now for a number of years, and I don't know what I think about the so-called crime in the first place, to be honest. I don't know what I think about that, but I certainly think on just a humane level, it's good that this man has been released and has gotten to go home. But at the same time, I think there are many people who are incarcerated who should also be getting to go home. I do think incarceration rates are way too high, too long, without opportunities of rehabilitation and compassion. So I think on some level he's an extremely lucky man. I understand that he's traumatised, so I don't mean to negate that by saying that. But good on him for the support he gathered around him, and I don't know the case well enough to really be articulate about it, but yeah, very interesting to see that Biden has finally said he's done his time.
And how would you compare and contrast portraying a political figure like Monroe to, say, artistic characters like Andy Warhol in Factory Girl and tragic literary figure F. Scott Fitzgerald in Genius?
Well, funnily enough, I'd say Andy Warhol's probably more of a political character than Monroe. Yes, Andy Warhol was making art, but I think he was pulling strings at the same time. So, I mean, any character that I play, I really look from the beginning at essentially the emotional arena that they're stuck in, that they're working from. And whether they work in this job or they work in that job, the thing for me is to understand and try and get a grasp on their strengths and weaknesses, their vulnerabilities, their confidence, their how honest or dishonest, etc. All that kind of stuff, aside from what their occupation is or what their external sort of motivation might be. So for me, it really always is a journey of emotional, sort of an emotional journey. Yeah. And then I sort of build on that, I guess. But that's the stuff I feel like I have to really get right. And then I rely on the script and the director to kind of have all the other pieces in place to portray the character that I'm playing. And if a character is a political character, if he's making political moves, if he's kind of having to sort of play someone off someone else, or he's having to maneuver, then I just want to understand what's behind that. I just want to understand why a character is doing that, what the motivation is, if it's genuine or if it's selfish or whatever it is,
And any last word about The Convert?
Just that I hope people see it. I mean, it's hard for me to know and be objective, really, how much of a history lesson this film is. Yeah. Because I've not seen many other films about this period in New Zealand. Obviously, there's The Piano, which from memory is around the same time. But as far as the cultural story of the Māori people. It's hard for me to be objective about how much light is shared in our film versus other films, but I really hope that people are moved by it and that it feels, not successful, but it feels authentic. And I was heavily relying on Lee and his knowledge of history to be able to tell this story. So hopefully people find it entertaining and are moved by it. That's my hope.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much, Guy Pearce, for joining us on the show.
No worries. Thank you, Perry. Good to talk to you.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
And that was some ironic music for this July 4th holiday week. And now on Arts Express, Dark Stories for Dark Times. Arts Express Paris correspondent Professor Dennis Bro on this year's Lyon Quai de Polar Crime Novel Festival. And, quote, marked by the intrusion into the spine of the novels by real-world problems and catastrophes going on all around the festival this year. Bro speaking in relevantly ominous tones, surrounded by terror fantasy music.
This is Bro on the Global Literary Beat, Breaking Glass. Today's episode, Dark Stories for Dark Times, the 2024 crime novel. This year, the Quai du Polar in Lyon, the largest European festival of crime novels and one of the largest in the world, celebrating its 20th season, was marked by the intrusion into the spine of the novels by the real-world problems and catastrophes going on around the festival. Each evening, just outside the festival walls in front of the town hall, there was a vigil calling for a ceasefire in Gaza, while inside there were novelists incorporating climate apocalypse, rapid income inequality, and the indignity of European cities, most notably Venice and Barcelona, overcome by tourism. In a panel on encouragement of reading, sponsored by UNESCO's Creative Cities Initiative, the Icelandic crime writer Ursa Sigurdardóttir, who ought to know since she not only helped create and chair the Reykjavik Crime Fiction Festival, but has written 15 novels, explained that Iceland has money to give to support all kinds of arts because it's one of the few countries in the world that doesn't have an army. She suggested, and not totally facetiously, that instead of destroying each other on the battlefield, Russia's Putin and Ukraine's Zelensky instead should duel it out by writing alternate chapters of a novel. Such an initiative is sponsored each year as two crime writers come together to do just that. This year's combined work is The Steve McQueen, which quotes the film The Thomas Crown Affair, which starred McQueen, since both are about heists that go awry. The novel is authored by Lyon's Carol Ferry and Northern England's Tim Willocks, whose most famous book, however, Bad City Blues, is set in New Orleans. A panel innocuously celebrating cooperation between France and Britain initiated in the Entente Cordiale, signed in 1904, that ended several centuries of armed conflict, took on a contemporary air when Peter May recounted why he had come out of retirement to write A Winter Grave, a crime novel set in 2051. In this nightmarish future, the Scottish Highlands are frozen but thawing enough so a dead body is discovered in an icy cave, while Glasgow is flooded, filled with acrid odors from the backed-up sewers, with cars replaced by Venetian-style water taxis. May related that after COP26, the 2021 Glasgow Climate Conference, which he attended, he became convinced the destruction of the Earth was not going to be addressed. He was so shocked by this cavalier attitude that he wrote a book in which the context that surrounds the mystery is a failing Earth, where 2 billion people are forced to flee their homes. He was not the only writer to address this issue, and one panel focused on dystopic worlds to come, a subject that had previously not been central to the crime novel, which has always been an excellent way of highlighting contemporary and past corruption, but has generally steered clear of the science fiction predilection with the future, a sign that the climate crisis is intruding everywhere. Back in the present again, the devastating effects of fossil fuel and mineral extraction showed up in Karen Smirnoff, who is now charged with continuing Stieg Larsson's Millennium series with The Girl in the Eagle's Talons. She explained that her sequel is set in the north of Sweden, home of Europe's last indigenous population, the Sami, where mining interests unearthing material for clean energy batteries often claim they can drill and dig on the land because nobody lives there. Smirnoff, the first female to write a volume of a series, which is now subtitled An Lisbeth Salander Novel, pointing to the popularity of the female character, explained by way of her book that a good deal of harm is done to indigenous lands in the name of safe and clean energy, where to get access to the minerals powering batteries the companies kill 6 lakes surrounding the mine. A panel on white-collar crime suddenly took an unexpected turn when the Italian mystery writer Valerio Barresi, whose novels are set in Parma in northern Italy's Po Valley, explained that his subject is the change in his town in the wake of the Reagan-Thatcher 80s. It was at that point that he observed the market economy driving human behavior, and the thirst and need for money and profits beginning to dominate human relationships. Barresi, who is also a journalist for La Repubblica, explained that after the economic crash of 1929, banks in the financial sector were governed by rules that have since been evacuated, allowing the second crash of 2008. His latest, The Lizard Strategy, recounts the eerie disappearance of Parma's mayor, just as he is about to be the subject of a corruption investigation. In light of the penetration of capital into all forms of life, he asked the panel a pointed question. Who governs Europe? Christine Lagarde, President of the European Central Bank, or Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Parliament? The rest of the panel refused to take up the question, and the moderator ordered Valerio not to pursue the subject further. A regular guest at the festival is France's most popular crime writer, Michael Bussy, whose novels are often diverting page-turners, but who this year appeared at the conference with his latest, My Heart Has Moved, which confronts the problem of increasing inequality in his town of Rouen. Bussy is a political geographer turned novelist, and he explained that the town is now more strictly segregated into the rich, more conservative right bank and the poor, more radical left bank, with the schools on the former now much less open to students from the latter. His novel is about the lifelong quest of a boy whose mother is murdered, seemingly by his working-class father, but who then discovered that the apparent truth may not be the case. Venice's Donna Leone talked about another kind of interpenetration of capital into the lives of the city's dwindling number of actual citizens who live there, with roughly 50,000 residents overwhelmed by the 30 million people who visit each year. For Inspector Brunetti, she said, does not operate in the land of the tourist, but rather pursues his cases by interacting with the still remaining locals, where he often unearths corruption amid what she called the most beautiful city in the world. She cited 2 examples of this corruption, the first being the often proposed tourist fee as a way of limiting visitors to the city by fining them if they do not have a permit. She described this as unenforceable because of the many ways of accessing the city and the limited number of officials verifying the passes, and thus simply designed to appease public opinion. A greater scandal she discussed is the again often cited project of a bridge from Sicily to the mainland, which has already consumed millions, and which, if it is completed, she hinted, would greatly facilitate traffic from organized crime to the mainland. One of the guests of honor was John Grisham, whose new novel, The Exchange, is a sequel 30 years later to his second and breakthrough novel, The Firm. He recounted how The Firm came to be published as a story that might inspire younger writers. His first book, A Time to Kill, later a publishing success and a film, when it was initially published, did not do well. He wrote the second and figured if it stiffed also, he would resign from writing and continue his law career. The book at first got no traction, but appeared to make its way to Hollywood, where it became a sensation and prompted a bidding war among 3 top studios before being sold to Paramount. With that success, the book then was also the subject of a publishing house auction, and he was on his way. Asked if he himself ever was in fear of the mafia because of the expose in the original of a law firm controlled by the mob, he said he wasn't, but that he had gotten a letter from the, at that time, mafia godfather, John Gotti, who was in jail for life and had plenty of time to read. Gotti wrote that he really enjoyed the book, but that the author had gotten the parts on the mob all wrong. Grisham said he wanted Tom Cruise to play the character, who is now aged 40, in the sequel, since Cruise is over 60, but doesn't look a day over 30. He said the character Mitch is inextricably linked to Cruise, and even referred to the character once as Tom. In The Girl in the Eagle's Talon, Lisbeth Salander grows up and becomes a mature activist. This year's Quai du Polar showed that the crime film, long a staple of exposing graft and corruption, is growing up as well and taking on the steadily accumulating and disturbing problems of an ever more complex world. This is Bro on the Global Literary Beat, Breaking Glass.
And we'll go out now with a very different July 4th elsewhere. The critical UK election challenging the warmongering status quo there and across Europe. Jack Clarke at our UK desk in a conversation with George Galloway's Alternative Radical Workers' Party local candidate, Matthew Alford.
Good evening. And today we have a special edition of the UK Desk in conjunction with the upcoming July 4th UK elections. While the political spotlight often falls on the usual behemoths, Labour and the Conservatives, today we're turning our attention to an intriguing candidate from outside the mainstream. Joining us is Dr. Matthew Alford, a D-list anti-celebrity academic and the Workers' Party candidate for Bath here in the UK. Dr. Alford's candidacy and his party's platform present a radical alternative focusing on the urgent issues of our time, from foreign policy to social justice, from affordable housing to environmental sustainability. Dr. Alford isn't just another face in the crowd. With a background in international relations and political communication, he brings a sharp, critical perspective on the reckless foreign policies that he believes have led us to the brink. Matthew Alford, welcome to the show. Now, firstly, what I'd like to ask you is, can you elaborate on the main reasons the Workers' Party is running in this election? And could you tell us a little bit about how the Workers' Party compares to other smaller or lesser-known parties in the UK, for example, the Green Party?
The Workers' Party is a socialist party that believes in renationalisation of some industries. It believes in infrastructure investment, and it believes in a sensible and sane foreign policy. George Galloway's first words after he won the Rochdale by-election a few months ago were, "Rishi Sunak, this is for Gaza." We share quite a lot, I think, in common with the Green Party, probably me as a candidate even more so than the party as a whole. I think that the Green Party is a bit flaky on these foreign policy issues. They put much more emphasis on climate change, which is an immediate problem, but one which will affect us incrementally over the coming generation or 2 or 3. Whereas I think that the major risk that we face in our international system on our globe at the moment is the threat of a third world war. And that has been put out there by a range of mainstream politicians in a range of different countries, and of course a range of different specialists from military and security and academic backgrounds. It's an extremely alarming time, and the chances of a major great power conflict in the coming months, let alone the coming 5 years, I think is very high and is seen as very high.
Given the historical context of the Labour Party's formation in 1900 as a party for the working class, how do you view Keir Starmer's leadership? Has he diverged from Labour's original principles, and how does the Workers' Party aim to realign with those values?
The Workers' Party is a more traditional socialist party. I don't think we're an extreme party in any way. We call for a 5% wealth tax on the most expensive properties in the country, which I think is over £10 million. So we would raise some money, moving slightly to the left for domestic issues. This is akin to the kind of policy platform that was completely commonplace in the 1990s, the kind of platform that Jeremy Corbyn was advocated during his opposition, which was to raise about 50 billion for the Treasury each year from minor tax rises for the very, very wealthiest people in our society. So I think that's the shift that we're making. Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer is a continuation of the Tony Blair project, which abandoned nationalisation as the core tenet of the Labour Party. But of course, Keir Starmer is far worse than that. Keir Starmer is an heir to Blair, also on issues of war and peace. Keir Starmer has been very supportive of the genocide in Palestine since October of last year. And various other, and supportive generally of an aggressive foreign policy of the arms trade and so on. So Keir Starmer to me is very akin to Tony Blair, but as our leader George Galloway says, Tony Blair without the laughs.
What parallels do you see with the transformation of political parties in the US, and what lessons can be drawn?
Again, I think that we're talking about a shift to the right, generally speaking, over the course of my lifetime, where right-wing parties, right-wing ideologies have become very, very normalised. In fact, we see that all across Europe at the moment, in Italy and Hungary and France, the rise of the right, the normalisation of the right, and something similar has been happening in the United States, the rise of populism over the past 10 years. So, again, we're moving away from, we're moving towards further and further into the idea that society, that the rich should be increasingly rewarded, that there should be a gap between rich and poor, communities don't matter, infrastructure and investment isn't very important as long as the rich can make a quick buck. All those kind of things are happening across our world. And of course, there are foreign policy implications for that as well, because actually the further you shift off to the right, the less likely there is to be internationalization, internationalism, agreements that are made across countries. You could still have potentially a more right-wing governments and still have international agreements, but it'd be much more difficult because they're going to be much more focused on nationalist issues, and so we need to have a sensible balance of those kind of things. The Workers' Party of Britain is a party which believes in reinvesting in Britain, in having a reindustrialization of our country as well. But we also believe in internationalism, in holding out our hands to the rest of the world.
In light of George Galloway's recent victory in Rochdale with a pro-Palestine campaign, what is the Workers' Party's stance on the Gaza conflict? What solutions do you propose, and how do those differ from the mainstream parties in the UK? How does your stance reflect or contrast with the positions of American worker movements and their foreign policy critiques?
George Galloway is a formidable foreign policy analyst, a formidable mind, a formidable orator, and a very, very experienced politician. He advocates, as does the party as a whole, an immediate ceasefire, but also a permanent ceasefire, which a lot of the other political parties have taken many, many months to come to even the idea of a temporary ceasefire. But what we advocate is a permanent ceasefire.
You emphasised the importance of foreign policy during this election. Could you discuss how the UK's current foreign policies are impacting domestic issues and why you believe a shift in these policies is crucial for the country?
There are many ways in which that is the case. Of course, the ultimate expression of that could be an escalation in Ukraine, probably as the most likely place, but also quite possibly in Taiwan, where Britain would no doubt be supportive of American forces as they are continuing to provoke things there. And in the South China Seas more generally, and also similarly in the Middle East, where there is the possibility of a war in Lebanon, between Lebanon and Israel, which could easily spread to Iran. There is, of course, one of the impacts of that would be our soldiers being involved, our soldiers being in harm's way, our soldiers quite possibly in great numbers being hurt or killed, and I certainly don't want that, and nor does the party as a whole. So that's one way, but of course there are many facets to this. I mean, just morally, as a country, morally actively supporting a genocide, and actively supporting the dismantling of the international legal framework is in so many ways horrendous. I mean, we have colluded with the United States and Ukraine and other national governments to destroy the fuel pipelines between Russia and Western Europe. I mean, this is an absolutely insane thing to do. It was economically suicidal by Germany to engage and refuse to investigate what looks like a US bombing in 2022 of its own major supply line of oil and gas, the Nord Stream 2 pipelines. So this is just one rather dramatic illustration of how we are willing to deindustrialize and harm our own economies to crawl on the coattails of the United States. So there are enormous range of reasons and extreme depth of reasons why foreign policy is of vital importance to domestic policy. There are more than that as well, and it's hard to see it because, of course, oftentimes we are looking at our own societies. It's hard to see the wider world, but in this election, more so than in any time ever, we absolutely have to look at this wider world.
So, Matt, with the election on July 4th being a, monumental game changer, an explosion in UK politics, a snap election to potentially snap us back or forward, depends on who you ask. I want to know, like you've got the Democrats and the Republicans in America, for us in the UK, we've obviously got Conservative and Labour as the majority two parties, and it looks like it may be a Labour victory, given the sort of destruction, quote-unquote, of the Conservatives over the years. Now, I want to know from you the fundamental differences of both of these parties and your thoughts on the outcome and what needs to change in UK politics. That's the fundamental question, Matt. What needs to change in UK politics?
I think the Conservative Party have to go. They have to go because they are exhausted. But if it was possible to give less than half a cheer for what's to replace them, then I certainly would. I think in terms of foreign policy, Keir Starmer, his office, ruthlessly pursued Julian Assange. And this was well before he was holding high office. So I think that is an indication of this man's political leanings early on. He's also someone who's talked about how easy he finds it to be ruthless. He has also continued to advocate the sale of arms to Israel throughout its genocide in Gaza, and he will only backtrack on those sort of decisions when under considerable public pressure, so when they are convenient, which almost makes him weirder and worse than someone who actually believes wholeheartedly in that kind of imperialist project. So I think that the Labour Party under Starmer, but just generally under the direction that it has hewed since Tony Blair and since the major foreign policy issues have become so pressing since September 11th, 2001, I think there is no chance of them being reasonable or sane even on foreign policy issues that are going to affect us in the South China Seas, over China, over Ukraine and Russia, and in the Middle East, and of course possibly over North Korea, and who knows elsewhere as well. I think that they are going to be an absolute horror show, and I think because they're going to have a whopping majority in the House of Commons, I think it's going to be very difficult to challenge them. So I think actually what we might need to do is marshal support from outside of the left, and as easy as it is to mock Nigel Farage, Reform looks like it could well get something like 25% of the vote. So they're not just a marginal party. We do need to, I think, to work with them in some way to change fundamentally, not just this country's electoral system, hopefully to introduce PR, but also its entire outlook in terms of foreign policy, particularly at this most dangerous of times.
Thank you, Dr. Matthew Alford, for sharing your insights on the Workers' Party and the current red and blue circus that is UK politics. This has been Jack Clarke for Arts Express with host Prairie Miller.
And that's all we have time for today on Arts Express, expression in the arts. And if you'd like to express yourself too, you can write to us at theradiogoddess@gmail.com. Until next time, this is Prairie Miller leaving the station.